Labour have made education number 4 of their 5 missions to rebuild Britain, pledging to break down barriers to opportunity by reforming our childcare and education systems. Here's newly appointed Education Secretary Bridget Phillipson speaking on Friday to ITV's Tom Sheldrick.
The process that we've begun is around how we tackle issues around attendance, which has a big impact on children's outcomes. We know if children aren't in school, they aren't learning, then that problem is going to continue. But we need also more teachers in our classrooms. We face some big vacancy rates and sadly too many children being taught by teachers who are not specialist in their fields. We've begun that process already to get 6,500 new teachers into our classrooms, but there is much more that we will need to do in the weeks and months to come.
Now, Phillipson was mostly laying out the government's plans for education reform. They've pledged to hire 6,400 teachers funded by the ending of tax breaks for private schools and scrap single-word Ofsted grades, as well as launch an expert review of the school curriculum and fund free breakfast clubs in every primary school.
So, to help us understand the party's ambitious plans and how Phillipson intends to put them into action, we're joined by Janeen Hayat, who's the Director of Collective Action at the Fair Education Alliance, a collection of nearly 300 organisations tackling educational inequality. Janeen, it's great to have you on Pods Over the UK.
Thanks. It's really nice to be here.
We came and did an interview for you guys at your conference.
And it was brilliant having you guys at the Fair Education Summit.
Thank you. That's why I raised it.
Yeah.
We're just trying to crowd our compliments for ourselves.
That was a top 5 moment for both of us.
There's been a lot of noise around Labour's education plans. They're really making it a central part of their offering to the public as a new government. What do you think are the sort of easy wins here in terms of their first couple of priorities?
I almost don't want to answer that question. I think the problem is the root causes of a lot of the symptoms we're seeing in education are not easy to fix. So you just heard Bridget Phillipson talk about attendance. We have big attendance problem in the country. I think persistent absence, which is missing a day a fortnight, is over 20%. Severe absence, which is missing 50% or more of school, I think it's about 2%. And the rates are much higher if you are eligible for free school meals. So if you're from a low-income household. So that's a massive problem, right? But what's driving that problem? Like, why aren't they turning up? So I'd like to kind of focus on the root causes of that. Or the teacher recruitment and retention crisis, which is another one that's really like broken through to mainstream media. Why are they leaving, right? Because Labour have pledged 6,500 new teachers, which is great. But retention is actually a bigger issue than recruitment. We have more teachers leaving classrooms in the last few years than we ever had before. I think it's 44% of teachers said that they kind of are considering leaving in the next 5 years. And that's losing experience. It's losing people you've invested in. And so kind of there's the quick wins of like, how do we drive that number up and fill the gaps? But also we really need to think about in a decade, how are we going to have that profession be more sustainable for the people who are in it, and particularly the people who are teaching the most challenging schools.
I just want to go back to the attendance points you made there. You know, there's a variety of reasons of why this happens. What actually are those reasons?
Children feeling like they don't have a way to thrive at school or have like a sense of belonging at school. So we've seen kind of a narrowing of the curriculum and a really kind of target-driven approach to educational outcomes. But a side effect of that has been kind of some children losing the things that they really enjoyed about school and the things that made them feel at home there. And we know we have a mental health crisis in young people as well. And combine that with rising child poverty and the fracturing of services that we're seeing in communities. And you have rising need, mental health need, but also all sorts of need, housing, food, gaps in the social care system. And so all of those needs are also kind of barriers to children getting into school and being ready to learn.
I just want to circle back briefly to this idea about changing the curriculum. So one of the things that Labour's proposing is a review of the school curriculum, and that sense that, as you say, it's become too narrow and academic, and this is going to require more funding in order to execute a broadening of the curriculum, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think it's something that looks quite cheap on its face, right? But then like has this cost in workload on teachers and in the time and energy it takes to implement a curriculum reform. One thing I'll say is that's why we need to think really long-term about it, like not bring in a change overnight and say, get on with it. But what we know we have a big gap in across the board is the skills that employers need. And that's a big driver of youth unemployment. So I think if you work backwards to how can the school system build some of those essential skills that we know are needed, like kind of across industries and regardless of technological development, right? We know that like employers are saying that things like communication and teamwork, creativity are things that they're not seeing in people entering the workforce. It seems clear that we kind of need to prioritize activities and a mix of things to help people build those skills is one thing. What young people want to see in school, we should absolutely be talking to them and involving them, putting them at the front, but also gathering data about like all of the holistic things, like what do you like about school, or what stops you from going to school, or when do you feel most at home there? But I think we have to be honest about the fact that something has to change, and we need to have a plan for bringing that change in sustainably over the next decade.
I mean, one of the things me and Nish were talking about was we were having our misty-eyed recollections of when we were in school. And of course, exams were important, but there's definitely been a shift towards a kind of like the exams and the exam results being the be-all and end-all. And so there's talk about moving away from that. And also, you know, I suppose in a way coinciding with that is talk about like how schools are assessed, both in terms of their exam results, but also in terms of Ofsted assessments. So the single word Ofsted judgment would be replaced with a scorecard system. I'm sure many of our listeners will be familiar of walking past a school and they have a big banner that says fair, which seems a bit cruel, just fair. And there'll also be inspections of multi-academy trusts, and there'll be an introduction of a new annual review of safeguarding practices as well as attendance and off-rolling. Off-rolling is the practice of removing a pupil from the school roll without a permanent exclusion. Do you think all these things together could create conditions that are better for teachers, where they can actually experience infusing young people with the passions of their subject?
Yeah, I think it's really early days, so I think they absolutely could. A huge part of Ofsted has been what results are the kids getting. And you can see why. It's hugely important. That's a barrier to progressing in education. It's a barrier to employment. But I think there have been some unintended consequences of schools, you know, off-rolling pupils who aren't going to get those results, or of teachers kind of feeling more pressure if they're teaching in really challenging schools because they can't focus on results as much because they're focusing on this really complex work of mitigating the impacts of poverty. There are more food banks in schools than any other kinds of food banks. There are schools providing transportation to students, buying washing machines for parents, making sure their kids have beds to sleep in. And in some ways, it's really amazing to see schools doing that work with no additional funding. But that complex work isn't fully recognized by Ofsted, and it's not rewarded. And you can't possibly do everything.
I want to talk to you about where we are so far with the new government. Government is so far missing a commitment to protect per school funding. So will the £1.5 billion raised from taxing private schools be enough to reverse 14 years of austerity and fulfill the kind of key promise on education, which is raising school standards for every child?
I think the answer is no. And I think money is the huge challenge. Whenever I listen to your housing episode, and I think as you zoom in on like every social issue, you're going to like run into the exact same problem, which is everyone is skint and everything massively needs investment. There isn't going to be enough money to restore everything to the real terms funding levels that were there a couple of decades ago. So I think the big challenge for this government is going to be striking that balance between how do we make investments for the kids who are in the system now while doing this long-term work. And there are, capital investments that need to be made in schools. Like we know, like there are buildings that are dangerous. We had the rack scandal not that long ago, and kind of everyone's forgotten about that, but it's still there. It's not fixed. However, I would say that there's lots we can do that doesn't necessarily cost that much money. One is shifting the incentives in the system and shifting what we value in the system. So teaching is maybe not competitive with other professions in the manner of pay, but we've been looking at how do you make teaching more competitive with other professions in making it more flexible for people with caring responsibilities, making it more diverse and inclusive.
Just to home in on and be specific to education, externally, just as somebody who's seen the election result, sees the size of the Labour majority, you'd be forgiven for just assuming, well, they can just do whatever they want, right? But in terms of education specifically, what are some of the kind of political roadblocks to enacting some of these reforms?
Yeah, I think the biggest one is making the sell for long-term investment that's not necessarily going to have demonstrable, shiny wins. But what we're asking for is this recognition of the complex work teachers in the most challenging schools do, and working towards a more sustainable profession that's more competitive in ways other than pay and more pay. The use of school space for nurseries that Labour has announced is really welcome because it's going to create supply in lower income communities, and it's going to better able nurseries to meet the needs of kids with special educational needs. Again, we have a big early years workforce problem, and we have an issue with kids who spend their first 5 years at home. All of the services that support them, everything that used to be there for a parent, has been kind of eroded. So we're going to need to kind of rebuild all of those ways of collaboration and networks.
Janeen, thank you so much for joining us on Pod Save the UK.
It's been really lovely. And if I could make a last plug for the Fair Education Alliance too, have a look at our website, have a look at our priorities for new government, and get in touch at info@faireducation.org.uk if you are a business or charity or school or trust who would like to work collaboratively with us.
The
Great.
listenership of this podcast, guaranteed there's people who work in education.
Yeah, for sure.
I know the hippies that listen to this thing.